I'm Dan Morris, you're watching Bosun Dan Bushcraft, and today we're going to be talking about knife sharpening. Well, knife sharpening, axe sharpening, all sorts of implement sharpening. And here I am again with my giant Winnie the Pooh cup of coffee. The essentials. Now, I am today, oh dear me, I know what that's about. I am today in my weight training shed, tucked away at where I live, and I'm here in here today because it is blowing a gale outside, and we are once again here in the middle of yet another storm that's blown over. Usually for a video like this I would do it in the back of my garage, but I don't really fancy getting Matilda out in this. I have to either take her out altogether and close the doors or prop the doors open, and I just don't want the wind blowing her about, so I thought it'd be an interesting change. Get ourselves tucked away in the little gym shed out the back here, and we'll get on with some knife sharpening, get something done whilst this weather's so foul. So firstly, let's have a look at some types of sharpening equipment. There's a heck of a lot of stuff out there for sharpening on the market, and you can get some things that are called automatic knife sharpeners, where it'll be in a little case and it'll have like a couple of interlocking either carbide or ceramic teeth set at a certain angle, ready for you to just pull your blade through. I don't have one of those because I don't like them. Personally, I feel that they remove too much metal. They're great for chef knives, cooking knives and things like that, particularly good for single bevel knives. We'll talk about that in a little while, but for the moment, starting from perhaps one of the most well-known types of sharpening equipment, and that is the good old whetstone, the double-sided whetstone. Now I've got loads of these. I got mine from a local shop in town, and I literally paid 99p for these, and I've had loads of them over the years. This one is really quite nice. It seems to be a type of baked ceramic, and they always have a smooth side and a coarse side. These whetstones, you use them with either oil or water as a little bit of a lubricant, and you get a much smoother result out of it. This is the good old-fashioned chef steel, which is basically just a lateral file. It's just a hardened steel file that has lateral or waved lines around it. These obviously, you know, ancient in design. They do work well. Again, particularly good for single bevel knives when we go through that in a bit. Excellent for cooking knives, but they are also really good for certain types of bushcraft implement, particularly those ones that have curved blades and things such as that. Now, these things have become quite popular lately and are finding themselves all over the place. And what these are is diamond sharpeners. Basically, there's a metal plate there that has been impregnated with man-made diamond, and that polishes the blade for you. Now, these are mostly to be used with just water. They would work with oil, but the problem with oil is it has a bit of a tendency to start stripping off the diamond from that steel plate and ruining them for you. And again, these are available in pretty much any hardware store across the land. They're dirt cheap. They don't last forever, obviously, but they are really cheap, and they're very lightweight, and carry something in your rucksack to work on your knives whilst you're out and about. Brilliant little things for that. All you need to do is get them wet and you're ready to go. And we've got the coarse, the medium and the fine. Now, if you're like me and you look after your edges very nicely and you never let them get dull, you would only ever need to take the fine with you anyway. Very transportable though, very, very nice. Now, one of the finest levels of sharpening that I have, which I very rarely use because I can usually do it on the other stones without any bother, is this type of sharpening stone, which actually contains two types of rock. Marble, basically two different grits of marble. Now, your grit is the word given to how rough the surface is, and obviously the finer the surface, so the larger the number, the finer the surface, the finer or the sharper your blade's going to be. Obviously that's dependent on how sharp you started with. You wouldn't take a knife that was really, really blunt and go straight to the ultra fine. You would have to go through the coarser things, i.e. the blue side of the stone there, the coarse diamond to actually get the edge to polish up as you go through the grades. But again, we'll go through that in greater detail. But this is ultra fine stuff. That's probably really for like razors, or if you want a razor edge on a knife, that's the sort of thing that you could use. And again, this one, you would just use it with water. You don't need oil. Especially with this ultra fine, and again, we'll go through all this a bit later on, but the oil on a stone such as this would completely remove the noise. And I'll explain why that's important later, because listening to the noise your stone makes gives you a lot of information. Now, one of my personal favourites and constant carry is this stone here. And that is, it's a Fulkniven DC3. Comes in its own little leather case. I've had a couple of these because I haven't worn them out. I keep losing the things. The back of the case has got rough leather on it there to be used as a strop for final polishing. And this is actually the stone that I use to maintain my oldest and most loyal bushcraft knife that you will have seen me with in lots of other videos. The Fulkniven 80, marvellous little blade, and always ever a razor blade. And I maintain it with this little Fulkniven DC3 stone. These are not cheap, and you can get far larger equivalents for doing larger equipment, but this is sort of your travel size. They're not cheap, they are worth it. One side is a ceramic plate for the really fine work, and it really does work. Even though I have other equipment, I rarely need to use anything else to put a shaving edge on any blade other than the ceramic there. Harder jobs, if you've got nicks in it or if it's quite blunt, you do have the diamond plate on the back of the stone there as well. Now, I did say with these diamond stones, they do wear out. They do, particularly the cheaper ones. This DC3, I have used this to sharpen so much stuff. I've used it on friends' blades, axes, and everything. And as yet, that diamond is it's as coarse as it ever was. It's as good as it ever was. It hasn't worn down at all. But then this isn't a disposable thing. This is going to last a heck of a long time. So in that sense, it's worth the extra money on it. But like I say, the cheapy ones, they're excellent for travel purposes. Keep them in your bag. Use them for what you need to. But I can really recommend the Fulkniven DC3 ceramic stone. And as I say, I aren't sponsored by anybody. I'll just tell you what I think works, really. Now, this funny little stone here, little orange jobby, that is another little tiny whetstone, and it has a bit of a shape to it for different angles. And that is actually the type of whetstone that is supplied with the Victorinox knives, so your little red Swiss Army knife. It's not bad. I don't mind it. I do use it sometimes, you can tell because it's dirty, but it's a little coarse. It's a little bit too coarse for my taste, but you can still use a coarse stone to get a fine edge. And again, when I go through actual sharpening later on, I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. It's all about angles and pressure and all of this. And then we do have also the Viking whetstone from Wazoo Bushcraft Supplies. Now that is a great little stone, actually. It's on a necklace at the moment. In fact, in one of my other videos, he's got the Wazoo Fire Striker there as well. And that works. You see it in one of the videos. Now, the Wazoo stone, again, is a whetstone. You can use it with water. You probably wouldn't want to put oil on it because you can wear it around your neck. It's the same as pretty much any whetstone, but it is incredibly fine and glassy, which I like, because like I say, I never let my knives get too blunt anyway. So that puts a real sweet edge on it. If you was to buy one of these from wazoo.com, it will come with what's called like a cat's paw knot that holds it on, which is a bit annoying to me. So what I did was untie that and put it on a lark's foot lash, so I can undo it and take the stone off, because, well, it's got that lashing on there. Obviously, you can see your problem. If you're grinding, you're going to cut your straps, and it's limiting your usage. So I just changed that so I can get it on and off fairly easy. Now, as a carry stone, this one's really good because it has all sorts of different angles in it and different shapes. Yeah, so you've got a nice rounded one there, and then a nice fine rounded one there, and then that line in it there is actually recommended to use the very fine corner part of it to sharpen fish hooks and things like that, which is good. because you know a lot of people don't bother sharpening; they'll just buy more. But if you've got a good lure with a good set of hooks and they've gone blunt, it's just as easy whip it on that a couple of times. Now the Wazoo one is one that's really good as well for serrated knives. Now some people like to use serrated knives for whatever purpose. It's never been my cup of tea, to be honest with you. I've never really seen the point in them. But with the little Wazoo with the little teeth there, so here's a bread. It's just a bread knife. It's not a bushcraft knife. But that little tooth there, especially when it's wet, is going to really be good at getting in to those serrations and sharpening them individually. Yeah, which, to be fair, a bread knife doesn't really ever need sharpening. It goes through bread. But that little stone will do a serrated edge. To be honest with you, that's part of the reason why I've always avoided serrated blades, is because of that faffing around when it comes time to sharpen the things. If somebody wants to explain to me what the supposed advantage of a serrated knife is, please feel free to get in touch. I get it when you're sawing through bread, but from a bushcraft point of view, not really that useful. So lastly on my list of implements is the good old-fashioned strop, the sharpening strop, which is really more of a finishing sharpening tool. If your knife is blunt, there's no point at all rubbing it up and down a strop. You will be there for years without making much difference. It has to be already sharp to use a strop. And one thing that people do a lot for stropping is they will just get a piece of leather and start rubbing away without really putting much thought into it. Now, that will have some polishing effect, but really when you're using a strop, you need to use something like this to rub on it first. You can already see how this is green where it's been rubbed before. And this is oxide wax. Now, can't remember if this is aluminium oxide wax or a different metal. There are lots and lots of different types of these oxide waxes using different chemical compounds, and as you would probably expect from that, those different chemical compounds basically do reflect the coarseness of them, so whether they're ultra fine or not so fine. But as you can probably guess, anything that's going to go on a leather strop is going to be pretty fine anyway. It's not really going to be coarse and gritty, to be fair. GoPro, stop recording. So we touched on a minute ago levels of grit. I'm not going to waffle on about this too far because really once you get used to sharpening things, it's not like you go, oh, I'll reach for the 1200 or something like that. You just get used to it and you get that feeling for what you're doing and you just go, I know what I'm doing, it's fine. But basically when it comes to levels of grit, the higher the number, the finer it's going to be. So this is somewhere around 800-900 on the smoother side and 500-600 on the rougher side. And right the way down, here today, the roughest thing would probably be either the steel or these actual, the gritty one there. Now, this is supplied, it didn't give me a grit count, but from my experience, that's going to be somewhere around 800 grit. And the fine one will literally, let's have a look. Yeah, that I'd put that between 9, 10, 1200 grit. A strop, anybody's guess, you're looking at the really ultra fine, so 15, 16, 80, I have no idea, but it's going to be way up in the thousands basically. So your grit that you talk about for how smooth or how rough the stone is works very much in the line of sandpaper really. The smaller the number, the rougher it is, the higher the number, the smoother it is. Now, depending on what state your knives are in, you're probably gonna want both, really. And some knives, when you buy them, want completely re-edging. We'll go through that a bit later on, because you might want to use mechanical equipment for that, to take it to a point where you can actually then sharpen it on the stone. Oh, I love coffee. Anyway, by and by. So earlier on, I mentioned about single bevel and double bevel, and this is when you're talking to people about knives, this is one of those things. It's like bringing up the Archer's Paradox, waffling on, or is Die Hard a Christmas movie, or are Jaffa cakes biscuits or cakes? It's one of them contentious issues that people argue about. Single or double bevel. The easiest way to look at it is most bushcraft knives are most likely going to be double beveled, and most, say, chef knives and things like that are quite likely to be single bevel. Now, that is not set in stone at all. It ain't about that. And people prefer certain things. So I'll tell you now, I prefer a double bevel knife just because it actually makes sharpening it a little easier, if you ask me. And the reason, say, chef knives are going to be mostly single bevel is because they are sharpened en masse. And none of this is set in stone. I don't want chefs telling me, I've got a sharp ended. Great, good for you. But largely, they're going to be sharpened on a good old-fashioned steel like this. I've worked in kitchens before. I've never met a chef yet that will let somebody else sharpen their knives. Nobody touches them. It's up to them to do, and they will not let you. Because of the action of using a steel, it tends to put a singular bevel on that blade. Now, what I mean by, and you please excuse my artistry here, I am no artist, and I have just drawn this with a Sharpie on the back of a paper bag because that's what I had to hand. So a single bevel would be like that, where literally the edges of the blade come down in one fashion, a singular fashion, yeah, at one angle. Whereas a double bevel would be more like that, where it comes down at one decreasing angle and then goes into a second, even finer decreasing angle. Yeah? Does that make total and utter sense to you, I hope? So what that basically means is if you were then sharpening a double bevel, you're going to have your bevel either side there that you can see. Yeah, just bring this a little closer. And you can't see the second bevel on this because it's so fine, it's right at the very edge of the blade. If I just glint it around in the light there, you might just be able to see how you've got just a touch of extra shine right on the very edge. That would be your second bevel. So I've already said the difference of equipment for blunt or sharp, and we've got the blue coarse side there for if it's more blunt and you need to put a lot more work in it, and the coarse side for if it's already quite sharp and you're just finishing that edge. And like I say, a bit later on we're going to talk about mechanical sharpening using different devices and things to do that. But you know, general rule of thumb, if it's quite blunt and you've got a really poor or damaged edge, you're going to be starting off with the rougher stuff. So the rougher side of the stone, the coarser sharpening equipment, which in this case is the red one for the diamond plate, and the good old steel. The steel, like I say, it's a good reliable way of doing it. It will remove damage quite effectively as well, and it works great as a coarse sharp. Well, it's great as a fine sharpener as well. Again, you ask your average chef, they'll tell you, yeah, hell yeah, I can get a razor edge out of a steel, and because that's more technique wise. But they're really good for using rough things as well. So basically, coarse or fine is all about how sharp your knife starts out. So, for example, so these two, actually, as you probably know if you've watched my other videos, I bought these from Raven Forge. This is the one I actually purchased first, and that I've been working on, and it's already got quite a nice razor edge. So for that, I would be using something like the DC3, and I'd be onto the second bevel, the final bevel, and sharpen it like that. But I took part in the Raven Forge mystery knife, where you pay a price and you get a mystery knife and you don't know what you're getting. And guess what I got? I got the very Raven knife that I had ordered the week before. Oh well, so I have two. But as I do say on the video where I give these a little review, these have been, again, double beveled from the start because the knife decreases in thickness down the blade and then goes to its final bevel. I prefer to have a wider final bevel. It is sharp, it's usable, it's just I prefer it to be sharper. So for the second one, I would be then starting it out on the much rougher stuff, on a finer angle, yeah? Although personally with this, I'm going to mechanically take some metal off it first before I get into that. Right then, so let's get actually into some sharpening technique here. Excuse me. As you can see, my trusty filthy towel has come out to play, and that's just because I don't want to get oil all over this lovely animal skin that I've got underneath here. And we're going to work on this one that I haven't done much work on at all. Now, as I said, this whetstone can work with oil or water. I tend to use oil more than anything, just because it's a bit more easy to control on the stone. It doesn't end up soaking through and getting everywhere, whereas water, you're just splashing around everywhere and making a big wet mess. Now, this is where that double single bevel thing comes in, because what I want to do is remove quite a bit of metal off this edge here. Yeah, so this whole knife is beveled down to the bottom, and then it has its secondary bevel right at the very edge there. So what I really want to do is, what I call these the cheeks of the knives or the axes, and what I really want to do is really polish those cheeks down to a much finer angle before I start getting anywhere near the very edge of it. And the way I'm going to do that is using the stone. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put it so that the edge itself, the cutting edge, isn't on the stone, it's laid back on a much sharper angle. So I don't know if this is translating through the camera, but you can see there's a gap between the actual cutting edge, but the knife itself, it's not flat touching the stone, it's just hovering above it. Yeah, so I'm not actually touching that cutting edge yet, that cutting face. And what I'm going to do is just start polishing the sides down without yet even touching that cutting blade. Yeah. Now, this has got a lot of metal in it, so the process of actually doing this on a stone would take quite a long time, but you get the idea. So what I'm doing is coming off the cut face, so the cutting face is hovering just above, and I'm literally making that whole bevel absolutely much finer, basically. Now for this, what I would do, because this is the grinding phase, we're not actually sharpening it yet, we're just grinding it into a better shape to take an edge. And I'm only doing this because this knife, it needs the work. You wouldn't do this sort of heavy duty work every time with your day-to-day knife that's already going to be pretty sharp. But what I would do is I would do them in runs of 50s, and then change the blade angle, turn the blade over to the other side, same again, set that distance angle so that the actual cut face isn't touching, and then bring it down another 50 times. Paying attention to getting that curve in as well. Yeah, so I'd do it 50 times one side, 50 times the other, and then inspect it to see where I'm going along. Now, as a quick tip to anybody who's a little inexperienced, because obviously we're talking about finding angles and things with it here, if you're a little inexperienced and you're not sure, because sometimes it's not always easy to see what metal you've polished. If you don't know, if you can't tell by looking at it and you're not sure, a simplest method of finding out, and these particular knives I'm using here aren't great examples of demonstrating this because the blades are black, but one of the easiest ways to work out where your angles are and how you're working away with your sharpening is to take a Sharpie and colour that blade area in. It helps if you take a Sharpie that works. I seem to have found a dry one here. Yeah, so colour all over that, either that or I've got oil on it, but colour all over that blade edge. I have to clean this up and try again. So I forgot that I'd actually sprayed this with WD-40 to stop it rusting, and I've just destroyed my Sharpie. But you get the idea. When your knife is clean and not covered in oil, colour the edge in with some sort of a permanent marker, and then as you're using the stone, you will see the pen removed by the stone, and it will show you exactly where your angle is. Okay, just don't do what I've done and soak it in WD-40 and then be absolutely bewildered why your pen won't stick to it. That is a great tip. To make it easier to find your angles. It's not something that I do personally. I've been sharpening knives that long, I just simply don't need to. I can do it simply by feel, and I can get the angles myself without any bother. But don't forget that nice good felt pen permanent marker, cover that edge with it, and it will show you exactly what you're doing with that stone. So, as I was saying, because I'm not going to spend the whole video sharpening the devil out of this one, there's no point, I'm going to do that personally a different time. But as I was saying just a moment ago, that good tight case that is, it ain't going to fall out of your pocket. As I was saying, with your angles and all of that, so even with a stone like this being single and double bevel, and I say I would only ever need to use the ceramic on this. But it's good practice that every time that you're going to sharpen your knife, if it's a double bevel, if it's a single bevel, you'll be doing it all in one go. But if it's double beveled like this one, it's always good, because it's the temptation sometimes is it's just a little blunt. So what I'm going to do is just polish up the very cutting edge. But it's good practice to always take some metal down from that first angle before you polish the second one. And that's just because every time you're sharpening the very, very, very cutting edge, you're obviously removing metal. Even though it's tiny, tiny amounts of metal, you're still taking that metal back just a little bit. And for every time you do that, the angle between that one and the second bevel, it then starts to chub up and go a bit fatter, which means the angle itself gets reduced and reduced and reduced. And when the more that angle's reduced, it makes it harder and harder to get that actual razor edge on it. So you always take some metal off the back bevel with that technique of not letting the cutting face actually touch the stone, but just taking it off the actual back of that bevel, and then change the angle to a sharper angle to start working on that actual cutting face. So as you go through sharpening and using the different grades and this, that and the other, a question I get asked a lot is, how do you know when enough is enough? How do you know when to stop? Generally, it's going to come down to things like the feel of the friction decreasing, and most importantly is the noise, which is why I said with a stone like this, the really fine stuff, you don't want to put oil on it because it will remove all the noise. Now, for example, a stone like this ceramic, they will all make a noise. And the thing is as well, pressure is crucial here, because the harder you press on, obviously the more you're rubbing it, the more you're going to be taking metal off. And it's only if you were in the rough stone grinding phase trying to remove metal that you'd put a lot of pressure in it. Now as you go through the grades and it gets sharper and sharper and sharper, you're lessening the pressure, okay, right the way up. So you can hear the noise of it as it passes down the stone. Yeah. Now what you're looking for is you want that noise to lessen and get lighter and get quieter, but never be zero, particularly with the finishing technique that I'll go through in a bit. But at the point where it goes really quiet and stops making a noise, you've probably rounded it. Because really, to get something razor sharp, what you're actually doing is creating a tiny little burr on the metal, and then you're polishing that burr to that final edge. And at the point where it starts to go really, really quiet, you're losing it, really. It's, you know, so yes, you're reducing that friction and you're making it go quieter as you go down it, but at the point where it starts getting silent, you're probably losing the ability to polish that edge. Now even something like the strop here is going to have a noise about it. If I just fasten that to there, I don't know if you'll actually hear the noise, but if I shut up, it's very faint, but you can hear it and you can feel it as well. We'll go through the strop in better detail in a bit, but it really is that process of feeling what the stone's telling you by the vibration it's giving out, and hearing it, listening to what it's saying to you as it's singing that old sharpening song. That is something you'll quickly get the hang of, especially when you're like, oh, that's getting sharp, and I remember the sort of noises that it was making. But pressure is the key thing. As you go through the grades of sharpening, you are lessening the pressure. Now, as we're talking about lessening the pressure, we step into something else now, honing. Now, honing basically means sharpening a knife, but in a different way, literally the other way, because what you're doing, if the cutting edge is coming towards you, that is grinding, yeah? And that's basically, if you're slicing into the stone with the cut face down, and it's the actual cutting edge that's going forwards, that's grinding. Honing is the exact opposite. It's where you're drawing the stone backwards over it, so the cutting face is running along it, yeah? So if you think of grinding is like you're trying to slice a very fine section off the stone, and honing is the opposite. You're rubbing the knife backwards on it. Now, honing is literally your polishing phase. It is kind of like the last parts of sharpening the axe or knife. because all of this translates to anything with an edge, axes and everything. Obviously the only difference with an axe is that it's curved. So as you've got the axe on the stone, instead of it being just a straight motion down the stone, you're actually curving it over the stone like that. I'm going to get some mockery for these hand movements, I can tell, but you're actually curving that blade down the stone as you're cutting into it. Honing is a great finishing technique for any and all bladed implements, okay? And by honing, it's literally, if I take the little DC3 here, what I'm going to do is put it flat on the palm of my hand and on the cutting face. Now honing you would only ever do on your final cutting edge. There's no point at all doing it on the first bevel. If you have a double bevel blade, there's no point whatsoever doing it. It's a polishing stroke. And what you're going to do is literally start at the bottom and draw it. Yeah? Now when you're honing, this is where listening to the noise it makes is crucially important, because whilst honing, drawing that knife backwards, if it goes quiet, if it goes silent, you've ruined it. You've literally polished the edge off and it's gone. But honing is one of those where you are rapidly decreasing the pressure as the knife gets sharper. I always test particularly this knife by seeing if it'll shave some hair off me, and when it does, that's when I'm satisfied. I'm not satisfied until it's shaving hair sharp, and that's simply because of things like gutting fish and things like that. When you've got a wet slippery trout that you're trying to get into the belly with a knife, your hands are all wet and slippery, everything's wet and slippery. You don't want to be sawing the living devil out of it because you slip. For some reason your skin will cut a lot easier than a dead fish. I don't know what that's all about, but you really want it to the point where you can just rub it on the belly and it goes straight in. That's why I insist on having them so razor sharp. But when you are back drawing it, honing it, you're going to use less and less pressure as you go through it, right up until the point where the pressure that you are using is literally just the weight of the knife's blade. So whilst we're on the subject of honing, the ultimate form of honing is a leather sharpening strop. Now these are not exclusively for the use of barbers. They work with all sorts of blades. Just a little adjustment there. Obviously though, the number one thing we associate strops with is straight razors. Very, 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 very sharp. Now a straight razor is usually a single bevel edge, although it may appear to be a double bevel edge, and the reason it appears like that is because razors, to make them easier to sharpen on a strop, are actually hollow ground. So you can see how the blade itself literally curves down to that point, yeah, from a thick part to a thin part, and they have always a very thick spine running down the back. And the reason that they have that very thick spine, it is there for a purpose. It's not accidental, and it comes down to the usage of the strop, and it makes it easier to use. There are a couple of mistakes that people make with strops all the time, very simple to do, and if you make those mistakes it will ruin your edge. This is why a lot of people, particularly for bushcraft knives, have taken to actually making strops flat on a piece of wood, like a plank of wood, or you know, a handheld handle, or something like that. In fact, another bushcrafter that I watch, building with sticks, Sticks Outdoors, you can find him, he's out there. He was making a strop the other day, I believe, a similar idea, sticking it to a piece of wood or something like that, and it does help in that sense. It helps prevent these two critical errors that people make. One of the first error, really, not holding the strop tight enough so that it stays flat. What you've got is, if you've got a big sag in your strop, what happens is it rolls over that knife blade on that final edge and it starts polishing it round, basically. So you need to keep your strop relatively tight. Now the other terrible mistake people make, and the reason why it has that thick spine, is because a straight razor, you don't sharpen it with an angle like that. You literally put the blade completely flat on the strop, and that's why that spine is so thick, because you're polishing that spine at the same time as you're polishing the edge. Okay, if you lean it and put angle in it, the same problem happens. All you're doing is bending the strop around it, and that's going to actually polish that edge completely off for you. And you'll be surprised, you'll be like, gosh, I've been doing this for ages, damn things come off and it's more blunt. That'll be why you're rolling it around the blade and literally polishing that edge off completely. So with the strop, keep it quite taut, and then keep your blade nice and flat. Now, if you've got it glued on a piece of wood so it is flat, not so much of a problem, because there won't be any flex in the strop. So you will then be able to give a little angle to actually get that final edge. It's a very shallow angle, because even when it is on a board, obviously the leather is soft, it's flexible, and the metal's going to press into it a bit and cause that little bit of curvature. And that's where people with stropping tend to go, it's rubbish, it just makes it blunt. It's the technique that you're doing is probably a little bit poor. Now with a strop, you never grind, so you're never cutting down it. You'll just slice through your strop and ruin it. It's always honing with the strop, okay? And again, cutting faces almost exclusively going away from you. Oxide wax, just give it a little rub over. You don't need to go mad, it doesn't need to be like solidly coated in it. And then literally, nice taut strop, nice flat blade. Yeah, keep the blade completely flat, and you can still hear the strop. It's making a nice little faint grinding noise, and that's telling you, that's giving you that information. And if that goes completely silent, check it, you might have gone far enough. Now, along the lines of that, testing the sharpness of your blade, that's really up to you. I've seen so many different ways that people like to use. A lot of bushcrafters will say, if it bites your nail without pressure, just the weight of the knife, if it grips like that one's doing right now, sharp enough. Some people like to do that whole hold up a piece of paper and see if it comfortably goes through the paper. I like to just see if it'll actually shave hair off you from somewhere, and if so, it's shaving sharp, more than sharp enough for anything you're going to be doing bushcraft wise. I'm not going to bother showing you that. That is obviously shaving sharp. It is in fact a razor. The more you play with it, the more you practice it, the more confident and consistent your technique is going to get. But obviously, remember, you're working with sharp objects. Don't rush it. Particularly with a strop, if you start getting a bit too cocky, you'll probably find that you're literally just going to end up accidentally slicing through your strop, and then you'll be buying yourself a new one, and that will be annoying. But remember that, guys, keep your strop tight. Don't be like ripping it off the wall or anything, but keep it tight, and keep your blade nice and flat. Let it find that angle itself, because if you start adding a great big curve like that, all you're doing is polishing it round. So again, just while we're touching on the whole idea of that honing, that backward stroking on the stone, that's where something like this, again, is a perfectly usable stone with its two faces of marble, or two different types of marble. Very fine, and it does still talk to you though. You can still feel the abrasion and hear it to an extent. Very usable, but again, these are final processes when it's already really sharp. And again, that type of stone, you would only realistically use that for honing. It would be less than useless really for grinding. It's not going to have the abrasion to do it. And again, you wouldn't use that anyway unless you'd already got a really nice sharp knife to start with. So if it wasn't sharp enough to go to something that, you'd use one of the other rougher grades. As I've mentioned a few times, the steel. Now, I use these a lot myself for kukri knives and things like that. It's just quick and efficient. But something that they are particularly useful for is when you've got something like a bill hook here that has that, he looks like a dolphin, doesn't it? Don't know if that's not really the noise that dolphins make. But something like that with a big curve down the edge, which obviously would be very tricky to work with a normal flat whetstone. That's where things like the little curved Victorinox stone come in handy, because that curve will run up that blade really rather nicely. But something like a steel works really well as well for getting in that curve. And anywhere you go where they're teaching you how to use a steel, they will tell you to do it away from yourself for obvious reasons, so that you're not cutting yourself. It's a bit more awkward. I've always done it towards myself, never took a finger off yet, to be fair. And when I've worked in places where people are using these all the time, they are always doing it towards themselves. I guess it's a skill thing, you've got to get used to it. So if you've never used one before, take your time, maybe do it the other way around. But for me, particularly with this billet, with it having the rearward axe blade on the back, I'm actually opening myself up more to snags from that back blade by doing it forwards. But it is, and you can get quite quick with them really, once you get used to using them. But again, that's most likely gonna, and you can use it for a double bevel, it doesn't really matter, but it's more than likely gonna create single bevels. But with no time whatsoever, it does create a really nice sharp edge. And you know, these are great tools for debowing things and all sorts of crazy stuff that you can use these for. Really nice tools to use. You can use a steel for practically any knife, but for most people, you're probably not going to want to use one on your fine bush knives. You're going to want the other equipment and make the edge just a little bit finer. Great for the bill hook and stuff, because it's doing a different sort of work. You know, you're debowing things, you're taking branches off, you might even be using it to bring down smaller trees, hedge laying, whatever it is that you're doing with this. It's very unlikely you're going to find yourself gutting a fish with it or slicing jerky with it or something like that. So the edge you get off the steel is more than enough, to be fair. So just going back, touching on the whetstone again, sometimes depending on what surface you've got to work with, slide about a bit of a nuisance. So it's easy, useful. Make yourself a board with just some pieces of wood screwed down that fit the stone in, that hold that steady, and then when you place it on whatever surface, it won't be sliding around all over the place for you, particularly when you're using something like an axe. And obviously when you've got a big axe like Terra here, and you've got it all the way by the head, and you're working that handle in like that, getting those angles right, you don't want your stone sliding about everywhere for you. I always take the axe to the stone. Some people prefer to hold the axe and take the stone to it. It's entirely up to you. That's a preference thing. I can't say that either one's better, to be fair. So, as any of you who watch my videos will know, here's my lovely axe Freya and a twin sister Frigg, and these two are always permanently shiny. I keep them as clean as possible. I just like them shiny. I like them clean. You can see them easier in the darkness, and who doesn't like a shiny thing? Now the way I do that is with a product called Autosol, an ancient product for polishing metal. And every single time that I have been out to the woods, I just give her a jolly good old polishing off with this stuff, and it gets them really nice and clean and shiny. It'll also take off tree saps and resins that get stuck to your blade, remove any little rust particles or anything like that, and keep it all nice and good and healthy and shiny. It also kind of leaves it with quite a waxy finish to it, which helps with the protection. And then when I shine that off, you can see straight away you automatically end up with a nice shiny product. It's quite humid in here today because it's quite cold, and so obviously because this axe head's very cold, the moment that I take the towel off it, it fogs up with my breath. But you can see a little bit of Autosol goes a long way into getting a good shine. And then once I've given them that little bit of a polish and a little bit of clean, to store them, all I do is spray the blades over with a bit of WD-40, because I have to keep these outside in the garage where it's more humid. If I take these in the house with me, the heads dry up, the handles dry up at the top, and the heads come loose. So I have to keep them somewhere where they are quite humid. So I just give the blades a good old spray over with WD, with all of them that live in the garage basically, and that keeps the moisture off them and stops them from rusting. But also with the timber handled ones, what I do wherever I'm storing them, I always put a few drops of oil across the very top of the headstock there. That keeps the water out when you're using them in the woods, but it soaks into the wood and keeps it swelled. And by keeping it swelled, it stops it from drying out and working loose, which is just always a good idea because a loose axe head's crap. And what happens then is if you have to use it loose, it'll rattle around and it'll only damage it more, which by and by means you then need to re-shaft the axe. And if it's something like this, where when you've been sat around a fire waiting for something to cook and you've got bored and you've sat carving it, you probably don't want to just replace that. But for keeping your metal clean, Autosol is fantastic. Yes, other products are available, but that stuff is brilliant, highly recommended. And you know, let's be fair, who doesn't have a can of WD-40 lying around? And if you don't, you should. Infinitely useful. Fun fact about WD-40 is it's actually more used for cleaning. Like by design, it's actually more for cleaning than as a lubricant. And if you've ever got stickers on glass that you can't get off or something like that, spray it with WD-40, leave it for a little while, and then just have at it with a cloth, and you'd be surprised how easily it gets it off. It's got all sorts of good cleaning applications behind it, that stuff has. So, sharpening. We've gone through quite a lot of stuff now. Like I say, it is all about getting your angles, listening to that noise and stuff. What about survival sharpening then? Let's look at it from a survival sharpening point of view. Now, it's wonderful if you have something like this, the Wazoo necklace, and it's even more better if you're actually wearing it at the time when you need it, but it's no good if it's hanging on your shelf at home. But there are other things that you can use to sharpen your knives while you're out and about. Obviously, you can find yourself a good stone. Ideally, something igneous and glassy is going to give you the finest edge. Gritty stones and sandstones would probably work perfectly great for grinding. I'm not showing you that because I ain't rubbing any of these on no rock I found in the woods, to be fair. But one thing you can use is this wonderful thing, or what's left of this wonderful thing. This is a birch polypore mushroom and is found exclusively growing on dead birch trees. Now, the birch polypore is an incredibly interesting fungus. It's got many medicinal properties, this thing. It was actually found on Otzi the Iceman. That if you haven't heard of him, just Google it. I honestly don't know how you spell Otzi, so use the microphone function on Google and just say it. But if you just search the Iceman, you'll definitely find a link in there to him. And he had these on a necklace, and that's because they've got fabulous medicine properties. This is why my example's got bits cut off. If you're feeling unwell, bad stomach, or just generally out of sorts, the polypores have tremendous regulatory capacity for a human. You can chop it up, boil it in some water and drink it as a tea. They don't taste the greatest, I have to say. And they are edible, but they're bitter and quite chewy. But they really are a bit of a cure-all, to be quite fair. And I remember all sorts of illnesses I've had where I'll be drinking polypore tea, and it really does make you feel quite a lot better. Now, when you get these fresh off the tree, the top surfaces of them are very soft and flexible and rubbery, and it has a wonderful quality where it sticks to itself really nicely. So if you was to cut a strip off and wrap it over a cut like a plaster, it would stick to itself like a plaster. And they are viciously antibacterial. There's nothing that I know of can live on the damp surface of a polypore. So they make fantastic plasters. They really do. Another thing that they are really good at is knife sharpening, would you believe it or not. Now, one thing you can do with them for that purpose is when they're fresh, cut a slice off the top of them and press it flat between a couple of things and let it dry out flat. And you can use that for sharpening, you can use it for honing more than anything. But also the inside, the rubbery inside, if you chop that perfectly smooth, which I haven't because like I say I've been using it to make tea with, but if you chop it perfectly smooth, that again makes a wonderful surface for honing a knife. And you will find these anywhere that there are birch trees, and they look like flying saucers have crashed into the side of a birch tree. This is a fairly small example of one, to be quite fair. They can get absolutely massive, but they do make wonderful little sharpening pieces of kit while you're in the wild. Now, you can strap on them when they're fresh. You don't always have to dry them out, but the chances are, have a good search around and you'll find one that's much older and possibly no longer living. That would be a better option. When they're fresh and still very squishy, great for plasters and other such things, not quite so good for sharpening. But you'll should always really be able to find an old one lying around that's ready to go through that process. So if you've not heard of the birch polypore, spelt exactly as it sounds, polypore, P-O-R-E, if you've not heard of these before, do some research on them. You'll be really impressed about what this little mushroom can actually do. Mushroom, fungus, I don't know if you class it as a mushroom, but it's definitely a fungus. So, but like I say, dead birch trees, you'll find them. Do some research on it, find out some information on them, because I'm telling you, once you've read about these things, they are wonderful. You'll never look at them in the same way. There is a guy who has I imagine there's several people, but there's one guy specifically who has done a video about the wonderful birch polypore, and I cannot remember his name or the name of the video. I'm sure you'll find him if you just search birch polypore. But he's done a video where he's so wonderfully excited and speaks really rather romantically about this marvellous fungus. So if you get to watch that video, you'll enjoy it. And he's got a hell of a lot of information. He's obviously into his fungus, and which most bushcrafters are. I'm not going to lie, I only know several mushrooms. My general rule of thumb is, if you don't know it, leave it alone. Well, we all remember that quote from Lord of the Rings: all mushrooms are edible, just some of them only once. So if you don't know for definite what they are, don't go messing with fungus you don't know. Them are easy to identify. There is nothing out there that looks like a birch polypore really, other than a birch polypore. And you can see it's very white where I've cut into it, but even on the surface, and this is obviously quite old now, but you'll see it's very cream coloured on the top. It's, like I say, it looks like a flying saucer's crashed into a tree. Pretty unmistakable. So another great idea for survival knife sharpening, or when you're out stuck somewhere. And to be fair, many of these are based on the premise that you're not letting your knife get too blunt. Because obviously if your knife is horrendously blunt, none of these are going to work. But for the most part, when we're all out and about, the chances are most of us are carrying a sharpening device on us most of the time, which is your good old-fashioned leather belt. Now obviously if you're not into leather as belts, well, that's terrible, because it won't work if you've got a fabric belt or any of those floppy types of belt. But a leather belt works just nice for stropping, and you always tend to have a nice smoother finishing face on the outside, that's the attractive face, and a much rougher one on the inside. Now, particularly for the end of your belt, you can put the oxide wax on it, leave it coated up in that, without really having to worry about it marking your clothes or anything like that, because that's going to sit on top of the other leather. It's not actually going to be touching your trousers. And to be fair, if you are you really that concerned about getting a mark under where the belt goes? And the other good thing is they tend to be, even if you might want to take it out of another loop, depending on how long it is, that's attached to you. So you can literally just pull it nice and taut from the end and start yourself stropping away without any bother. So a good old belt strop really does work nicely, and it's literally just your leather belt just lightly rubbed over with one of those forms of oxide wax. And once this stuff has soaked into the leather, it does last quite a long time. Even if you can't see it there, it still remains present and is still really efficient. Welcome to my messy garage. Say hello to Matilda here, because another, I don't know if you'd call it survival, it depends if you're stuck in a survival situation and you've got a car lying about, but another good emergency sort of sharpening measure. And once again, this is, as with a lot of these things, this is strictly for back honing, and it's really more for your knife has just come off a razor edge and you want to put a razor edge back onto it. This would be less than useless if your knife's blunt as hell, if you've been cutting rocks with it, or if you're like some bushcrafters I've seen, and this makes me cry when I see it, gutting fish with it lay on a rock, and you can just hear every oh, it was the rock, oh, you've killed it. But a car window, now the lovely rounded edge of a car window makes for brilliant honing, particularly with older vehicles. Matilda here being a prime example, as she's about, I don't know, 50 something, she's 1974, I can't be bothered work it out. But for back honing, and this mirror is kind of in the way, it is supposed to do that, I'm not just breaking it for your benefit. This edge on the window, and you'll hear the noise. It is brilliant for finishing that razor edge. Now, you might not want to do that all the time because obviously over time it is going to leave a mark on the glass edge of the window. It's going to do some damage over time, but that's why I refer to that as an emergency sharpening measure. But it does work, and it really will put a nice razor edge on the blade for you. By all means give it a go. If you break your car window, however, I don't want to hear about it. That's your fault, but it does work. I know that it works, and I have used it a few times in situations where I've been out, knife's not quite got the edge that I would like it to, and I want to cut something or gut the fish or something, but the car or one of the cars is with me, and it does just put that lovely finished edge on it. So again, it's a little bit dark in here. I seem to be struggling for lighting around here, but another little sort of, call it survival or emergency sharpening hero, things like ceramic pots. And the good thing with ceramic pots is that they have lots of little shapes in them, corners and edges. So again, if you're sharpening a ceramic blade, brilliant. Also, they work fantastically with water as like a whetstone or oil or anything like that, and they work really well. Water is probably better than oil with these, because if you've ever had one and watered a plant in it, they soak water in like no man's business, so it's easy to just dip them in water and work with them like that. And then same again, you can just hear that ultra fine noise. Beautiful. And obviously, if you've like got stuck in the jungles of Borneo, you might not really be finding ceramic lying around, but the chances are, if you're anywhere in the world where there has once been a human settlement, the chances are a quick dig under the ground and you will likely find some form of ceramic or pottery. And as a general rule, ceramic, man-made ceramics and pottery and things like that, they do tend to be finer than stones and rocks that you might find lying about here and there. So one of the things that I touched on earlier was mechanical sharpening. Excuse me, I'm crammed right at the back of the garage between Matilda and this shelf where this massive radio controlled boat that I still haven't done any more on yet is just languishing around. Mechanical sharpening is in using mechanical devices, tools and things like that. Now there's nothing wrong with that at all. There is nothing wrong with mechanical sharpening, either that being in device form or simply using something like this sanding thing. Cheap little effective sander. It come from Lidl. It wasn't much. It works pretty nicely. There are a couple of concerns with mechanical sanding, mechanical sharpening, particularly depending on what you're using it, like using grinders and things like that. Now, grinders are a bit of a dodgy one because obviously they're designed to remove a lot of metal very, very quickly. So it takes a lot of skill and confidence to use those, or you may well destroy what it is you're trying to polish up effectively. I have and do use grinders on some things, particularly axes, and usually when I've got hold of an axe from a car boot sale or something like that and it's had a bit of abuse and the edge is now that fat that it's not realistic to sharpen it on a stone, I will take it down with the grinder first. But I've been using grinders for eternity, cutting cars and things like that, so you need to be really careful not to take too much metal. Now there is another concern as well. So what I'm going to do is I would only use these sorts of things anyway to put that first and larger bevel in anyway, so it's going to be very flat against us, not completely flat but really quite angled against that sand pad. And again, it's not actually going to touch the cutting face as I make the pass over it. And obviously I have to follow that curve. And again, I'm not actually touching the cutting face. So you can see already I've started to expand the bevel, which is basically decreasing that penultimate angle on the knife, which ultimately will allow me to polish it finer on that final angle and result in a sharper blade. That was just 4 passes across the sander, and this is the biggest drawback of mechanical sanding. I can feel the blade has warmed up. It's not hot yet, but it's warm. Now, if you were to keep doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it, you would obviously, it would get hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter. And the problem with that is, if you get it too hot, like maybe not, it's not so easy to do with a machine such as that, but with an actual angle grinder, it's very easy to very quickly get that metal red hot. Now, the biggest trouble there is, get it too hot and then you get it air cold, it will ruin the temper of your metal, as in the hardness. Knives and axe heads and things have a hardening process, and the last part is tempering, which is where it's taken up to a certain degree of temperature. And I won't give a number because it depends on exactly what you're trying to achieve. There are different rates and things. And what happens is it's taken up to a temperature, and then it's left to air cool after the quenching. Now, if you're blacksmithing and you take, say, a knife blade or any metal that's been really hardened, if you want to then turn it into something else, you do something called normalizing. So to normalize a metal means to stop it from being hardened, to take it back to mild steel. So to normalize, what you would do is take it until the point where it's glowing a yellowy, a whitey yellow color, and then you would just leave it to air cool. And that'll normalize it, and that means it's no longer hardened steel, i.e. it's no longer a knife, because mild steel, yeah, you can get it relatively sharp, you won't get a razor edge on mild steel. It'll always be a little bit poor. So if you get it too hot and then you leave it to air cool, chances are you've normalized it, you've ruined the temper in it, and it's not really going to be a knife anymore. And like I say, the hardening processes are quite complicated, so you're not likely, unless you're really an experienced blacksmith, which if you were, you probably wouldn't be watching this video in the first place. But hardening metal is a complicated process, because if you go through the hardening and quenching process, you will just end up with hard steel, but it turns to something what people call glass hard, which literally means it'll snap or shatter very easily under impact, which is what the tempering is all about. So you would take it to a really glass hard hardness, and then the tempering brings it back to a little bit of softness to give it a tickle, a flex, so that it will literally just pour up with a little bit more sort of abuse and movement. Because your first hardening process it makes it so stupidly hard that it will shatter, basically, which is why you don't do things with tools like, you don't hit hammerheads together, because they're of equal hardness. One of them will give and shatter, and I've had that happen in the past. The same as axes, it's why they tell you not to beat the back of your axe if it's stuck in a log with a hammer, because one or the other is going to give, and shards can fly off at really high speeds. They can be really very dangerous. There's nothing to say you couldn't beat your axe head through a log with a wooden mallet or something a lot softer than the metal. That wouldn't be dangerous, but you certainly wouldn't use anything that's like tool steel. So you wouldn't start welting it with a sledgehammer, because the chances are one of them's going to fracture. And as I've said, that fracturing can be really quite violent. Now, if you've got a lot of work to do to take your bevel down using a device such as this, it's quite simple, really. You can either, when it's not too hot, just let it cool down on its own, or every couple of passes, dunk it in water, dry it with a towel, carry on, just keep it cool. You would have to take it to quite a temperature to damage that temper, probably over 600 degrees, but at 600 degrees it will start to show heat. It'll start glowing, really. Around the 600 mark, stuff will have a faint red glow, and the hotter it gets, the brighter it glows. It's fairly obvious, but every couple of passes, just take that heat back out of it and you would be okay. But like I say, for things like angle grinders, they operate that much faster. The discs are designed to remove a lot of metal. It's very easy to both destroy your temper with temperature and also simply destroy it just by ripping too much metal off it. So that's just about it for this video, guys. If you are, well, I assume many of you will be, but if you are going to start working on your sharpening skills and practicing, playing with those angles, honing and all of that, I strongly advise getting a cheap knife that you're not too bothered if it doesn't go well with, and get your practice up before you take those skills to your really decent equipment. It doesn't take long with a bit of concentration to get really good at it, to be fair, but a bit of a warning, it does get obsessive. Once you start getting decent edges on it, you won't, like me, you'll end up as you just won't settle for less than shaving sharp, which is fine, fair enough. A sharper knife is a better knife. It removes so many other issues, and I know a lot of people that say, oh no, sharp knives are dangerous. Not from a bushcraft perspective, because say you're making wood shavings, your knife's not sharp enough and you're having to really put force through it, a slip could turn into a big problem, because flesh is not as difficult to cut as wood. So for reasons like that, a sharp knife is infinitely better. It takes less effort to use. Anyway, that being said, as always folks, get yourselves out there, get enjoying yourselves, get having fun, be safe, get your practice up, and keep bushcrafting. I'll see you all again soon.